IVM.
How would you like to be rewarded for paying your credit card bills on time? Cred gives you the chance to be part of an exclusive club of highly trustworthy individuals where you get cashback and other rewards for being good. Now that's a great policy. So don't miss out. Just download Cred and be part of the club.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, folks, and welcome to All Things Policy. I want to turn today to a country that I wager we have never talked about in All Things Policy until this day, and that is Finland. And we're talking about Finland because the Finnish Defense Forces recently came out with their first ever military intelligence review. And why are we talking about this? Well, it has a lot that is interesting in relation to Russia. We talk quite a bit on this podcast, but it's nice to get a perspective on how countries on Russia's western periphery see Russia. It also talks about the Arctic, another geography, a region that we have covered in this podcast. And so it's interesting to get a Finnish perspective. After all, Finland is very much an Arctic littoral state. It is also a country with a complicated relationship with Russia. The two countries, of course, were at loggerheads, were at war in the Second World War, and have had a complex relationship through the Cold War and the post-Cold War era. So I want to start by asking you, Aditya Pareek. I'm joined by my fellow Aditya Pareek. Can you tell us, this is apparently the first time that the Finns have come out with such a review publicly. So one is, what prompted that? And what are some of the important points that you see coming out of this new report?
Thank you, Aditya. It's great to be back on the show. And to answer your question, I think this review was a signal that there's been a change in Finland's strategic intellectual culture, and that now they're going to do these analysis and reviews which would better communicate what their defense policy is. So I think the points that the review highlights can best be found in the forewords of this document. There are 3 forewords to this document, believe it or not, 1 page each, but pretty significant. And they would give you a very clear, concise picture of where Finland's intelligence ecosystem, its intelligence oversight ecosystem, and defense priorities in general lie. So talking about the first forward, it's about Mr. Mika Kari, who's the chairman of the Intelligence Oversight Committee, which has recently been established by law in Finland. So June 2019, Finland adopted a bunch of legislations which will guide the intelligence ecosystem in Finland, and they also have provisions for judicial as well as civilian political leadership's oversight on all the intelligence activities that Finland's security services would undertake. So Mika Kari in his foreword talks about how it is important to them that they don't let anything happen that jeopardizes basic and human rights. So when they say basic rights, I take it for what we would call fundamental rights in India. So fundamental rights and human rights is something that they are thinking prominently about when they talk about oversight. It is also about operational security. It is also about secrecy and effectiveness. But the fact that Finland has, if you read the background of these legislations, which were enacted in June 2019, it talks a lot about a lot of commentaries, and a lot of official text published by the Finnish government also talks about how they've studied international verdicts about human rights, and they've integrated elements of those cases into their own national legislation. And they've also looked at other countries' law regarding intelligence oversight and the whole slew of intelligence oversight apparatus that these countries operate with quite mature military or civilian foreign intelligence apparatus. So I think there's one aspect of putting civilian and judicial oversight. And the other aspect, I think, would be found in the foreword of the overall commander of the Finnish Defense Forces, whose foreword is the second one here. So, General Timo Kivinen, he acknowledges in his foreword that Finland's neighbors are spending a lot on their military capabilities, and this has a direct impact on what kind of capabilities and the readiness of these capabilities they can bring to bear against Finland or other powers in the region. So when I talk about the region, right, this review also designates Northern Europe and the Baltic Sea as the area of concern and the security environment that Finland is dealing with. So the Finnish defense forces are primarily concerned about their geographical littoral being Northern Europe, obviously, naturally, and the Baltic Sea. And his forward also talks about how gray zone tactics and war by other means is something that Finland takes seriously and recognizes as something that can destabilize the world order that they're operating in. So they talk about how societies can be, put into disarray by sabotaging critical functions, sites, and individuals, which might result in conflicts without any direct conventional military action as we know it to occur. And the third and final forward is by Rear Admiral Juha Bakunen, who's the chief of the intelligence staff for the Finnish Defense Forces. So, as we can see, the military intelligence apparatus in the Finnish Defense Forces is a multi-service domain. So, the person who heads it believes that the military intelligence apparatus and ecosystem is being transformed by the new powers that they've gotten and the clarity that has come to their foray in their activities, and the new legislations would guide them quite a bit. So he talks about one thing I'd like to really mention is that he talks about how the activities of other foreign intelligence agencies have increased quite a bit in Finland's area of concern, that is Northern Europe and the Baltic Sea, to quite the same level as the Cold War. So he's talking about how Finland faces, he doesn't directly say it that we're facing a threat, but rather that is what he's insinuating here, that the threat of espionage, the threat of these gray zone tactics is just quite about the same as the Cold War.
Yeah, we've seen these type of concerns expressed of late by other countries as well. And so this review seems to be part of a pattern in terms of the challenges it highlights. One other country that we see mentioned in these reports typically is China. Does it mention China? And if so, how does the report make an assessment of China?
It does talk about China, but it talks about it in the global security picture. This review is quite a bit concerned about the littoral space that Finland exists in. However, it does make a few passing references to the global rivalry between the United States and China. So it's talking about the world order and how that might impact the Arctic and Northern Europe in that sense. That if global powers are going to contend over resources in the Arctic, that's also going to impact Finland and its fortunes. So apart from that, China isn't really seen as a threat or singled out in any way. So I don't think China, apart from its Arctic ambitions, is something that Finland really cares about.
And more specifically, Aditya, what does the review tell us about the northern sea route of Russia? The fact that it's increasingly more feasible. How does that affect Finland's perceptions?
So Finland actually takes Russia quite seriously. It doesn't antagonize them, but talks about how they've used military means to achieve their political goals. And, it's a part of Russian strategic culture to, take other countries that they feel threatened by or feel a rivalry with, that they're going to engage in hybridnaya voina against them. That is hybrid war against them. So Finland is very well aware that Russia thinks of them as a perpetrator for this. and this is my opinion. The document doesn't say this. So Gibridnaya Vojna being practiced by Finnish military intelligence is something that Russia takes seriously. And Finland talks about the NSR as a kind of strategic geography that Russia is going to feel threatened with. That, hey, Russia's geopolitical fortunes are quite a bit to being bet on at the NSR and the Arctic in general in the Far East, as we've talked about on this podcast before. So Finland sees the NSR as this sort of a strategic competition that they would have to really watch out about, because when all the world's major geopolitical powers can converge over the region, there's going to be sparks flying, and Finland would really have to up its game, both in terms of intel assessments as well as operational intel. So I think the potential clash between NATO members and, say, the Baltic states in their strategic geography, in their area of concern, as well as NSR, is something that Finland is quite aware of. And I think they specifically mention how it is important that Russia has upgraded its northern fleet based in Murmansk to a full-fledged military district. And it is a clear indicator that Russia takes its Arctic fortunes very seriously and is willing to fight for it if the time comes. And one more thing I'd like to really mention about the way this review has dealt with oversight. There's a bit of wording in some places which tells you that this business of judicial oversight, I mean, it talks about the legislations from 2019 having provisions for the District Court of Helsinki, which is the capital of Finland, having jurisdiction over issues of basic and human rights. So fundamental and human rights. As far as I understand it from this document, if the Finnish military intelligence or any other part of the intelligence apparatus feels, or rather the in general security apparatus feels that, hey, we're going to conduct an operation or we're going to use tactics which might be against the charter that we've been served by our state in defense of certain basic fundamental rights or human rights internationally or inside Finland. So they would have to first ask the judiciary that, hey, can we undertake such an activity or not? So I think that is worth mentioning that here with the strategic geopolitical competition, the oversight and the care for universal human values, so to say, as we identify with in our current day and age, are important to Finland.
Okay. And what about COVID-19, which is the other big geopolitical event of our time? What is its assessment of the pandemic and its impact?
So the pandemic is something that the review treats as a major factor in most of its empirical observations, let me say that. Because honestly, they've put this as a peg to build the case for the entirety of 2020. The document is literally titled Finnish Military Intelligence Review 2021. So it's basically supposed to, in major part, recount what they did in 2020. So 2020 being dominated by the pandemic and people's lives, economies, entire nations, their functioning being frozen in place by the worldwide lockdowns, definitely had something to do with the military intelligence and intelligence apparatus in general in the world suffering from. However, they just look at it when you talk about the exact text of the document. Now, they only talk about the integrated nature of the world economy and how it works as a deterrent against international conflict. I mean, they recognize this as an empirical fact and as a balancing tool for policy issues among nations, so that it is unlikely that conflict would break out, because it's a very circular kind of an argument that a lot of people, a lot of forums, a lot of intellectuals make. So they've also made it that, and it's empirically true at some point, because warfare just evolves, even if it can't take place openly anymore. So they've acknowledged the devastation that the pandemic wrought on nations and global economies, the supply chains, and the things that globalization was based on. So they've come to this conclusion that although 2020 was pretty bad in terms of how devastated connectivity all over the world was, it is, however, unlikely to change the security and political priorities of the world. Yesterday, the kind of geopolitical troubles that Finland had are the same today when we're in 2021. And even if the pandemic subsides, it is likely in their assessment that those problems are still going to be there. So their larger neighbors, their forces that they can bring to bear on Finland's border are going to be the same. So in in that sense, they don't really see the security or political scenario changing much. So the only tangible thing that I could find in the whole document that they say has been hindered, it is that they observe that the movement of intelligence agents on the ground. So this definitely means the proverbial James Bonds of their service, as well as those of on the adversarial side. Their movement would have definitely been curtailed by the worldwide lockdown. So that is the only tangible thing that I could find, that the pandemic in their domain really hindered.
Yeah, absolutely. To render it more realistically, people working out of Finnish embassies will have a harder time meeting their contacts or getting information from them. Okay, so we have covered broadly what the assessment of this military intelligence review is. The other thing that is interesting to me, and you mentioned it earlier, was how Finland enacted this legislation in 2019 that covered the activities of military intelligence. This is really interesting because we do not have anything like this in India, even though they've been called sometimes for some such legislation, for some such oversight. Can you tell us what this review says about accountability from Finnish military intelligence and what methods they are allowed to use to acquire intelligence?
So, the methods haven't directly been laid out, but they give you a analogy which tells you more than enough, really, in my opinion. So they equate their activities with law enforcement. That, hey, we're not doing anything that is beyond the realm of possibility. We don't have special technology which the police doesn't have, or the other law enforcement agencies around the world don't have. So they're relying on the same kind of human. They're relying on the same kind of tech int and signals int. So they're dealing with the same apparatus that the police does for apprehending criminals. So this time they're just dealing with military intelligence, in the sense that they're looking at adversarial forces and making an assessment of them, trying to stop leaks from happening from their side. That is counterintelligence, that which is also, as they mention in the report, a part of intelligence apparatus. So also, one thing let me mention, which is important, is that they very clearly, and I've never seen this before, that they've laid out clearly that, hey, our defense attaches abroad are also involved in carrying out intel assessments. So that's something, I didn't really expect. So they've acknowledged the role that this is, very acceptable and compliant diplomatic function, that to our defense attaches are observing and reporting on the policies and developments which are happening in the host country where the embassy of Finland is, and they're reporting and assessing whatever forces that that country has, and the policy changes in terms of restructuring the forces or acquiring equipment, that sort of a thing. That's completely legal and in compliance with diplomatic culture around the world. They really use that phrase, in compliance with diplomatic culture. So this was really something novel for me, that you're actually telling them. It's not really just that, I used to think of military attaches as this person that goes and represents their force as an ambassador, which is in line with how countries treat their armed forces generally. So this is something new to me, that, hey, this person is as much intelligence analyst as much as an ambassador. So that's something novel to me, somebody putting it out so clearly.
Yeah, in fact, I'd argue that the line between diplomacy and espionage is essentially a dotted one, and there's a great deal of overlap between those two. But it's interesting to see how the Finns conceive this. Thanks, Aditya, and thanks for bringing to light the sort of issue that we would not normally cover in All Things Policy. And thanks for giving us insights not just into how Finnish military intelligence is looking at this, which is a very niche subject, but also how it more broadly ties into assessments about Russia and perhaps even to some extent China, as well as the Arctic. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Aditya.
And thank you all for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, Cred, Ciet, TheWholeTruthFoods.com, and PayPal. We really do appreciate the support. On Cyrus Says, we discussed quite a bit about the local assembly elections this month. Vasanti Hariprakash was there to talk about the West Bengal elections, and then we also spoke to Pradeep Gupta, a psephologist and author. He's the chairman and MD of Access My India. Do definitely check that episode out. Great conversation. Tune into This Round Is On Me, where Gauri Devi Dayal caught up on the latest trends in the PR industry with Archana Jain from PR Pundit. On The Habit Coach, Ashton Doctor spoke to Anandita Chatterjee. She's the founder of Travel Chatter. She's been a marketer with some large firms and has traveled to 67 countries so far. It was a RuPaul Drag Race fan club on KBCD where Farhad and Sunetro discussed the show's best moments and talents. Amber Rana was joined by celebrity fitness trainer Shivoham on Know Your Kanun to discuss fitness laws and regulations in India. They talk about the laws and infrastructure that exist to protect gyms, trainers, and also consumers in the fitness industry. And on the note with Maruk Inayat, we have clinical psychologist and friend of the network, Sonali Gupta. She talks about ongoing mental health issues like survivor's guilt, coping with anxiety around the pandemic, and doom scrolling. And with that, we hope to see you again next week.
Want to learn something new and have a few minutes to spare? Well, then go for the Traveling Professor's Diary, where I, Siddharth Deshmukh, the Traveling Professor, will help you glean from all the insights that I've gained from wherever I've traveled, learned, taught, and repeated. Join me every Tuesday and Thursday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.